Rolfe Cremer was the apothecary and the medical officer to Norwich's workhouse and infirmary for 51 years from 1830 to 1881. He lived the final years of his life at 26 Princes Street in Norwich with his daughters Julia and Harriet, and is buried in the church next door to it, St George's Tombland. In Edward Tillett's 1891 history of St George's Tombland, R. Cremer Esquire, meaning he was a gentleman, is mentioned as living at the southwest corner of Church Alley, next to Mr. R. Brett, with no Esquire, a greengrocer. Cremer's story is one of how Norwich was a pioneer city for the regulation of professions and the welfare of the poor, but also the welfare of the gentry. How the new professions became the way to support an extended family when being a gentleman farmer was no longer an option. Robert Rolfe Cremer was born in 1799 in Gimmingham, North Norfolk, the fourth son and one of 11 children of John Cremer, a gentleman farmer who had been in the Norfolk militia, and Harriet Smythe. John Cremer was one of a long line of gentry in North Norfolk, dating back to Henry Cremer, who was born in Elm in 1500. Robert Rolfe Cremer's uncle, the Reverend Robert Rolfe, was a first cousin of Admiral Horatio Nelson. Robert's oldest brother joined the army, becoming a captain in the Royal Artillery. It seems that his second oldest brother, John Mott, went into the law but was in some way incapacitated by his 50s, as even though he didn't die until his 60s, he became dependent on relatives and supported by friends when he was living in Elm Hill, around the corner from Robert, in the 1850s and 1860s. Robert's third oldest brother, Philip, died at the age of 19 in 1816. So, given that his other brothers had pursued the usual routes for the sons of gentlemen of going into the army or the law, Robert chose another route, medicine. At the age of 20, in 1819, Robert became a licentiate of the Society of Apothecaries. The Apothecaries Act of 1815 had given the Society the power to license and regulate medical practitioners throughout England and Wales. It was the beginning of the professionalisation of medicine in the UK. In 1820, Robert Cremer's father, John Cremer, died at the age of 65. It seems no one took over the farm, as all his farming stock and household furniture was sold by auction over 4 days, even though his wife Harriet was still alive. She moved to Brighton and died there in 1829. A few years after qualifying, Robert Cremer married Phoebe Elizabeth Myers in St James, Paddington, in London in 1822. In 1830, Robert became the resident apothecary for the Norwich St Andrews workhouse. He lived in Elm Hill, at the public dispensary there, not far from the workhouse, which was behind St Andrews Halls on Bridge Street, where the Norwich University of the Arts now is. Apothecaries in the public dispensary in Norwich were employed by the Court of Guardians, elected from Norwich citizens. By the mid-19th century, apothecaries were provided with a salary of £100 per annum, around £12,600 in present purchasing power, with an allowance for coals and other essentials of £12. They were given an unfurnished apartment and were to visit the patients as often as the physicians may think proper. They must not employ themselves in any private practice, nor absent themselves from the dispensary without leave from the dispensary committee of the Court of Guardians. Apothecaries and surgeons were awarded the occasional bonus on top of this. In 1833, the Court of the Guardians awarded 30 guineas to Robert Cremer for his extraordinary and persevering attention, which saved a considerable sum of money to the ratepayers, doing the work of 2 people, and commended all the medical officers for the skill exerted with so much courage and humanity to mitigate the malignant effects of a cholera epidemic in the previous year. In the 1840s, Robert Cremer was living in Elm Hill with his wife Phoebe, a female servant, and Robert's nephew, 6-year-old John Robert Cremer Plowright, who will reappear later in this story. Phoebe died in 1843 at the age of 50. They did not have any children. It seems that shortly after her death, Cremer married a Cathedral Quarter local, Julia Knight, who was born in 1810 and baptised at St Peter Hungate on Princes Street. Their first child was Julia, born in 1844, although it seems she was the only surviving twin from the notice that was made of their birth in the Norfolk Chronicle. Then came Robert John in 1847, and Harriet in 1848, Ellen in 1850, Arthur James in 1851, and Laura Sophia in 1854. Ellen died in 1852, at only 2 years old, and was buried at St George's Tombland Church. Perhaps to accommodate a growing family, the Cremers moved from Elm Hill to St Andrews Street, or St Andrews Broad Street it was then called. With 3 children under 5, Cremer then had to cope with another cholera epidemic, which hit Norwich in 1848-9. No wonder that in 1850 one of the Guardians reported there had been complaints of the manner in which Cremer had dispensed medicines. Not incompetence or unwillingness, he said, but simply from his having too much to attend to. He was awarded a £10 gratuity nonetheless, the equivalent of around £1,300 now, by the Court of Guardians, in slight acknowledgement of his services during that time. How awful the conditions must have been is illustrated by the engraving on the right by John Leach, which appeared in Punch magazine in 1852, entitled A Court for King Cholera. In 1853, Cremer is again the subject of discussion at the Court of Guardians. It appears Cremer went to a respectable bookseller and stationer, which turned out to be Thomas Priest's in Rampant Horse Street in Norwich, and asked for some books to be bound, with the cost to be put down as blotting paper and stationery for the dispensary account. The bookseller did not know what to say to him for the moment, but felt inclined to kick him out of the shop, local newspapers reported. But Cremer, on seeing the bookseller hesitate, said, "Oh, that's nothing. That's constantly done." Cremer explained to the Court of Guardians later that the book in question belonged to the Guardians, but the cost of binding was too high. He expressed regret for the impropriety of his conduct, and a hope that in consideration of his 23 years' service it would be overlooked. It was, and in 1854 Cremer was receiving £113, which is about £12,400 in current purchasing power, a year as a resident apothecary. It doesn't seem very much, though, especially as by then his fifth child, Laura Sophia, was born.